It's the only opportunity I have, and I really value it. And I particularly value it because of the link we're making. A link about sustainable development, healthy women, healthy planets. And I'm also very pleased and honoured to speak to you as chair of the Global Leaders Council on Reproductive Health. We were brought together in order to re-energise and sort of recommit to issues of reproductive health and family planning. Because globally, there are so many attempts to somehow deflect from the commitments, to get into all kinds of issues that bring about a kind of stigma on this whole area. But those of us on the Global Leaders Council on Reproductive Health fundamentally believe in the central role played by reproductive health, sexual and reproductive health, access to knowledge about how to space and have choices about numbers of children and having access to contraceptives. And I will come back to that. I'm very pleased to see the profile of this gathering and to see so many young people, especially in that corner over there. The reason for that is I wear another hat. Actually, I don't like wearing hats. Unlike many African women who wear these wonderful hats that stun you, I actually don't particularly like wearing hats. But I have hats that I use for purpose, you know. And the hat I'm probably proudest of is a quite recent one when I was invited by Nelson Mandela to join a group of elders. Yeah. And we have a very bossy chair who's well known to everybody in South Africa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He keeps us in order. But what President Nelson Mandela said to us when he brought us together in May 2007, so we're a relatively young organisation of elders, he said, one thing I particularly want you to do, and that is to reach out and listen to young people, be close to young people. Now, I'm a bit afraid about Esther, who's on the panel here, because she's already asked me questions before, and I know she's got a lineup of questions that she wants to put again. But what can I do? Nelson Mandela told me I have to let Esther ask me questions, so she'll ask me questions. But, you know, on a rather less happy side, in a way, I was glad to have the opportunity to get out of Durban. I actually know Durban quite well because I was here 10 years ago for the World Conference Against Racism. I was the Secretary General of that difficult World Conference Against Racism, but thanks to South African leadership, we succeeded. We got our declaration and plan of action. So I hope that this COP17 will also succeed because it's in Durban and because it's under the hosting of South Africa. But I was very glad that Oxfam, you heard that I'm honorary president of Oxfam, asked me if I would join them in going out to a community about an hour's drive from here. I don't know how many of you would know the area of Verulam. We were asked to go out and meet with a small but very effective project called Project Empower. And the Project Empower was to empower young girls, young women. And we met the mobilisers and volunteers of this local organisation, which is supported by Oxfam. Project Empower works with women affected by HIV and AIDS, empowering them to access their sexual and reproductive health rights. We met a number of young women, a bit older now than the young over there, more like Esther's age, I think, or maybe younger than Esther even. I'm not sure, we'll get into that. But several of them had come from Eastern Cape, a long way away in this country, the other side of this country. And they had come to Durban hoping to get jobs in the city. And instead they find themselves in an area of rural poverty. And it is really difficult. And they were very open and very sharing of the difficulties. They had dreamed of a better life for themselves, but the daily reality they were talking to us about is nobody's dream. They spoke about the problems that they were encountering, the negative impacts of alcohol on their communities, the violence against women that was very prevalent, the unplanned pregnancies, the reality of women even having to use their bodies to gain money, transactional sex. But the good thing was that they were able to talk about the problems because they weren't considering themselves victims. They were strong young women. They had learned to say no and to say, respect me. They talked about going into some of the clinics, and especially encounters with the police, and the police would not respect them. And they said, we do not accept that anymore. We know now that we are valued members of the community who must be respected, and we are trying to empower other women. And what really struck me, at the end of our conversation, we were meeting in a creche, so we were sitting on kind of child chairs, near the bottom, small children chairs. And as we sat there, I said to them, each of them, I said, tell me, if you had a wish, what would you wish for? And I was so fascinated. They didn't say, I wish for, a new fridge or a car or something. They said, I wish that I can empower other young women to have the strength that I've learned about. And that was the real message. It was a very generous wishing on their part, that they will have access to female condoms, that they will have access to sexual and reproductive health, that they will be treated with respect by clinics and by the police if they're complaining about violence, that they'll be taken seriously on the issue of domestic violence. And then I'm very glad to say we ended up, as Peggy knows, I like to end up singing and dancing together, and that was the nicest part. So, what is the connection between health and this major conference that South Africa is hosting on climate change? I have the honour in my foundation to be focusing on climate justice. And when you put the words climate and justice together, you understand profoundly that it is the poorest who are having their livelihoods undermined by the changes in the weather. When farmers don't know how to predict the seasons, when there's more flooding than there was, when there are long periods of drought and then flash flooding. I've learned a lot from a woman who's sitting over here, my friend Constance O'Kellet from Uganda. And Constance has told me about growing up in her village in Uganda, and there were predictable seasons. So people knew when to sow and when to harvest. And then, unfortunately, that changed to long periods of drought and then flash flooding. When we met each other again, quite accidentally in the African pavilion, we were going to meet anyway, but we met before we planned to meet. And I said, how are things, Constance? And Constance said to me, we have had terrible rain recently, and my fields, my hectares of groundnuts are destroyed, and I am really worried about next year. Isn't that right, Constance? This is the reality. And that is the reality for so many people here in South Africa, so many people in all the countries in Africa. And it's those who have least responsibility. I met the Caravan of Hope that's come from Burundi to be with us, and it has 10 countries represented. And there was a very powerful woman from Zambia, and she said, I don't own a car, I don't even own a bicycle. Why am I having to suffer from these greenhouse gas emissions that I had nothing to do with? So that's the justice element. But in fact, that means that people have to be even more resilient. They have to be even stronger in being able to cope with the drought and the flooding. And this has huge health impacts, but it also has huge burden impacts for women. So it's all the more necessary that we have access to family planning and reproductive health services in order to build up women's resilience. And it's critical to exercising a basic human right, the ability to choose the number and spacing of one's children. It's vital to improving women's health and that of their families. It enables women to seize educational and economic opportunities. And it helps unleash women's power to solve problems associated with climate change. We need women to be agents of change in their local communities and nationally. I'm going to have time to answer questions later, and I can bring out other points that I'd like to bring out. So I just finish at this stage by referring to what my colleagues and I in our foundation have been doing in helping to bring out women's leadership at the top level here in this conference, to match the women's leadership at community level, grassroots women, women in academia, who are trying to bring out the gender dimensions of climate change, including the reproductive health and family planning dimensions. And we started in Cancun with the support of Mexico, and we have what is called a troika plus of women. Now, I don't expect that table in the corner. Does anybody know what a troika is? Anybody in the room know what a troika is? It's a word that is used a lot in the European Union, and it means 3 different periods of chairing. And that happens a lot in the EU because you've got 27 countries, and so at the moment there's a troika where Denmark will be chairing at the beginning of next year, and then it will be Cyprus, and then in the beginning of January of 2013 it will be Ireland. That's why I know about that troika. So Ireland is becoming part of a kind of troika of the EU. Well, it so happened that the first chair in Copenhagen was a woman, Connie Hedegaard, who's now the EU Commissioner for Climate. And it so happened that in Mexico, for COP16, it was Patricia Espinosa, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. And it so happens that the chair of COP17 is a woman. Who is she? Maite Mashaban. And so these 3 women helped to form this kind of troika with all the women ministers of environment and energy and agriculture. I met your South African Minister of Agriculture yesterday, and youth and women's affairs, all the ministers and other leaders. And now that we've got the women sorted, we're bringing in friendly men, because it helps to have supportive men as well as women. And what will we be doing when we meet on the 7th of December, which is next Wednesday? We'll be sitting at tables like this, but no speeches. It'll be more, what have you done and what are you going to do? To put gender more on the agenda, to make sure that the Green Climate Fund has a proper gender management and gender values so that money gets to women on the ground in adaptation. What are you doing about transfer of technologies? What are you doing about mitigation? What are you doing about adaptation that has a strong gender focus? And in particular, what are you doing about things like food security? That should be on the agenda of a climate thing. And what probably won't come onto the floor of COP17 is the issue we're talking about. We're a bit ahead of the curve. We're a little bit ahead of things in making that further link between the need for resilient communities, the need for women to be able to be as strong in adaptation as possible, and therefore have access to reproductive health and family planning. Just how bad is the situation for women globally? Believe it or not, about 215 15 million women in the world would love to have access to contraceptives. Female or male contraceptives, contraceptive pill or other methods of contraception, in order that they wouldn't have unwanted, unplanned pregnancies. 215 million. If we were to solve that problem, we would not only help those women to be better mothers and better leaders in their family and their community, we would also do great work for the climate, as we will hear. So it's interesting that look around now, look around at those young people, and remember, in years to come, that you were at a meeting that was ahead of all the talk that's going on in the formal meeting with President Zuma and all these people. They're not as bright as we are. They're not as clever as we are. They have to be understood. Thank you very much.